My name is Erik Fadiman. This is Website Makeover. And Craig and I talked a lot about this class, and I'm really excited to be bringing it to fruition because we've been living in this theoretical world of let's build a website, and it didn't necessarily have constraints. We built whatever I wanted to build, which was valuable for showing techniques like HTML and CSS, but we thought it would be more instructive to people to go beyond just the coding practices and deal with a real client. So we got out the word through our social networks, and we found it was tricky finding the right sort of client. We needed a site that met our needs, met their needs, something that was due for a redesign and was suitable for the needs of this course. So we're going to be designing the Juan de Fuca Festival of the Arts. Those of you who live in the Puget Sound area know that the Strait of Juan de Fuca is just north of us, between Washington and Canada, near Victoria and Port Angeles in Washington. And they've got an arts festival. Now, because of a few legal restrictions, we can't quite show you exactly what their website looks like. If you go to jffa.org, you're going to see something slightly different. We had some photographic restrictions, but more or less, this is what their website looks like. And I'm going to be working with their director, the director of that organization, Dan McGuire, and each week I'm going to meet with him. I'm going to ask what his needs are. I'm going to come up with an entirely new site design for him, and I'm going to build that, and then I'm going to share that with you. While it would have been exciting to do this in real time, live, we'll cheat just a little bit, and usually I'm about a week ahead. So in a sense, you're seeing what I've done in the past week, but we're going to try to keep this as close to reality as possible. So here's the site we want to redesign, and I have to keep in mind that we're designing for 3, if not 4 different demographics. When I start designing and redesigning a website, I have to keep in the needs of the client. I'm sure that Dan wants it to look a certain way, and he probably has a board of directors that he has to meet with as well, and they want their site to look a certain way. But we also need to keep in mind the needs of the user, and I keep this purple circle at the top of my chart because the needs of the user need to be primary. The needs of the client and the needs of the designer, what I want, need to be subservient to the needs of the user. We really need to keep in mind who are the users, who is using this site, and what do they need to get out of it. And then, of course, because that wasn't challenging enough for me, I created a subset, but it's not in my Venn diagram. If you look at my blue circle off to the bottom of my screen, the needs of the creativeLIVE audience. In a sense, if I dumb it down too much, if we oversimplify this, no one's going to watch the show. And if I make it too complicated or too abstract, we can't cover that kind of material in the time that we have. So I've tried to find the perfect client and the perfect path so that we can create a positive learning experience for as many people as possible. So I did some guerrilla usability testing through the miracle of social networks. I got on Twitter and Facebook, and I asked people I know, I said, what does this site need? How would you redesign it? I pretended that I was talking to the users of the site and said, what is your response? I got more responses in terms of visual design than functionality, but I do want to share that response with you. The input that I got from various people: lose that red outline, the header graphic is confusing, improve that contact form, get rid of that stainless steel texture, make it wider. Some people dug into code view and looked at the source code and realized that the entire site is built in tables. Now, while I'm embarrassed to admit, as late as 2005, I was still building sites in tables, but, well, I guess that was 6 years ago now, so that certainly says that the site is dated, it's due for an update. Everybody who is at least beyond the beginning level of building websites now knows, I think, you don't build websites in tables anymore. We use CSS for layout. A lot of people told me that the site is unclear, that it was hard to navigate. Frequently I was told that it looks dated. And they told me that although you can't see it in my static image, there is actually a slideshow up in the header graphic. If you go to jffa.org, you'll see that there's a slideshow, but many people found that to be confusing and really small. And then a real point that a lot of people said is make buying tickets easy. It's a music festival. A lot of people, they don't want to read a bunch of stuff. They just want to get the tickets. Make that super easy. And also make it really clear when this is happening. The JFFA website needs to meet 2 purposes, in that it's the website for the organization, but the festival also happens on these dates, so we need to make that really clear. So once I did that and we sort of assessed that, I talked about that with the client, and Dan said, yeah, those are all good points. Let's focus on that. And we also talked about what he was looking for, because they want to promote their music festival, and they have a lot of challenges. There's a lot of competing music festivals. And he said that he wanted to appeal to a contemporary audience. He wanted it to be generally younger and hipper. That doesn't mean it has to be just for young people, but the look and feel needed to be a little fresher. He also said that this is regional. Most of the people are coming from the Olympic Peninsula, so we had to keep in mind localism and the sense of place, but we couldn't ignore the bigger cities of Victoria, Vancouver, and Seattle. My Seattle audience here knows the magazines, our local papers, The Stranger and the Seattle Weekly. He said he wanted to advertise in those, so it needs to be simultaneously rural and urban, meeting the needs of a sophisticated demographic. He also realizes from his own information that a lot of people are travelers. They're coming from other countries and other parts of our country, and they have a choice where they're going to spend their music dollars. So he wanted to appeal to people who have that sort of luxury to go from one music festival to another, so he wanted to look sophisticated. He also agreed that tantamount, we needed to simplify that contact form. He wanted to improve their social media presence. He's starting to realize that Twitter and Facebook are really important for marketing a site. We wanted to make that more effective. He wanted a more attractive slideshow. And then in terms of the data, the actual content that's happening on the site, he really wanted to promote upcoming concerts, breaking news, and making sure that there was a downloadable schedule in PDF form, schedule of the actual concerts in Memorial Day weekend. He wanted to improve the navigation, and he wanted to keep the existing logo and retain a Pacific Northwest feel, a regionalism, a sense of place. So if that wasn't challenging enough, there's what I want to do, because most designers are only in it for themselves. But I realized it probably still needs to work in Internet Explorer 6. Matt's covering his face there, but I'm only taking a guess here. Is anyone here from the Olympic Peninsula? I'm guessing that there's still a lot of people using Internet Explorer in the Kitsap County region. Someone in our audience is nodding their head. Safe bet, you're thinking? Thank you. And their current file size is 300K for the front page. That's kind of small by today's standards, but I thought if it's working for them now, let's keep that as our file size as well. But I wanted to start using @fontface because I've been telling my students at Seattle Central since day one in September, start using embeddable fonts in your web pages today. If I gave them that advice, I have to follow it as well. And of course, I wanted to use jQuery for the slideshow. And I swore that I was going to build it in HTML5. Not all the latest features, but just to future-proof it because I'm not the last person to work on the site. Someone's going to inherit this code from me. But if you read my New Year's resolution that I posted to Facebook on January 1st, I said, I'm only building in HTML5 from now on. Now, a lot of people think, you're going to build it in IE6 and build it in HTML5. Can you do that? And I'm here to tell you, yes, you can. I also agreed I wanted a simpler contact form, and I wanted to put in Google Analytics code. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, Google isn't the only analytics tool out there, but analytics data is really handy. Think about the webmaster or the person who's going to update the site after you leave. If they can get some real analytics data about who's using the site, what their browsers are, if we can get some real actual data about who's visiting the site, we don't have to do so much guesswork about things like do we need IE6 or not. And I think that'll be really valuable for them in terms of their marketing and promotion efforts. If they find that people are coming from as far away as Texas or New Jersey, they can certainly market to those areas. Of course, I'm going to use CSS for layout. And of course, I want to make it look great. So we've got a lot of constraints here. I'm going to try to make them all balance out. And what I like to do now, before working with a client, is start with wireframing concepts, particularly since the client is remote. He's up in the Olympic Peninsula. I'm down here in Seattle. We're only able to talk on the phone. A wireframe, in a sense, is a type of agreement. It's a contract that says, these are the regions of the page. It isn't necessarily a design solution, but it says, this is what we agreed to build. So I showed him a couple of ideas. I said we could do it this way, or we could do it that way. We talked about all the components that he wanted on the front page, and we talked about different ways of arranging those. We could have a slideshow which runs the width of the page. We could have a left column. We could have a right column. But this is what we settled on. So we knew that he wanted to sort of have this information about save the date up at the top, a navigation bar. The primary actions that we wanted the users to see on the left were being able to subscribe. So where it says subscribe to JFFA, This is removing the contact form and just putting an email newsletter sign up, because if you remember the original contact form, it had name and address and city and state, and they're not mailing anything out, so they don't really need to gather that information. All they really needed was give us your newsletter and get on our mailing list. So that becomes simplified. The opportunity to buy tickets becomes a prominent link, and social media becomes prominent. To the right of that becomes our slideshow, and then a list of performers, breaking news and upcoming events. And at the bottom, of course, we saw from some other music festival websites, they very gracefully put the sponsors' logos in the footer. We would be nothing without our sponsors, so he felt that was really useful. So what I like to do at this point is I don't begin designing anything until I have this wireframe built, and once I have this wireframe built, I make this work in a CSS layout with divs and floats before I even open up Photoshop. So this was really helpful in helping me in my process. The wireframe is sometimes confused with the sitemap, and some people use these terms interchangeably, and it's not accurate. I also set up a sitemap because this too is an agreement between me and the client to say, this is what we're going to build. This is the actual number of pages. And we had some back and forth on this, which was a little confusing, because I said, all these subpages, see this column under festival on my left, I said, are these all parts of the festival pages, or are these unique pages? And he responded to me that those were all unique pages within the festival page. And we kind of got into a circular go around that. So you can only accomplish so much between email before you have to pick up the phone and say, what exactly are we building? And so I sent him this sitemap, and at the top you see primary pages, and on the bottom you see pages which are only reachable when you've clicked on the festival page. They're exclusive to that region. But if you look closely, you'll see that I've made a mistake, that I've gotten this far with a client, and performers also a main link, tickets also a main link. Isn't that the same as performers and tickets? So this is one of another great times when I say do as I say, not as I do. Clearly there's an error in my sitemap, but this is something which I'm going to identify and fix before we start building next week. We'll call it poor communication on my part. So then I made an estimate in order to sort of share this process with you. And a lot of people say to me, how much does a website cost? And I said, well, I've built websites for $500 and I've built websites for $5,000. A lot of it depends on who your client is and what their budget is and how much process you think this is going to take. I gave a pretty generous estimate, well, excuse me, not generous to my client, generous in terms of the hours that I think it's going to take. I decided to err on the side of caution. And I've broken this down into a 5-week project plan. So if you look at the first week, I don't know if you can read that, but I want to do a website audit, a usability analysis, and some research of competing sites. I wanted to build my wireframes, my sitemaps, do a little bit of code preparation, which is what we're going to look at today, and my time meeting with a client and writing a creative brief. I'm estimating that this is going to take me 9 hours, and this is the bulk of what I'm going to show you this week, before I even open up Photoshop, before I even design anything. And this is a good way to sort of test your clients to see what their budgets are. So if you say, well, you know, I charge this much and it's going to take me 9 hours just to get to know you, times my hourly rate. If they say that was my whole budget, you realize this is probably not a good fit for them as well as for you. So there are agencies and firms that are bigger than me, which would probably spend even more time on this, and there are probably lean one-man operations who could probably do it for half the cost. So what I'm doing here is estimating number of hours, not how much it should cost, because is Beiser out there in Bulgaria? He's going to respond in about 3 seconds. I'm sure Beiser in Bulgaria is going on a different economic spectrum than I am. People all over the world, where you live in a rural or an urban area, what your cost of living is. Beiser's nodding. Beiser's here. Beiser's probably charging less than I am in Bulgaria. Somebody in New York City is probably charging more. Just to pay the rent on their tiny apartment, they've got to charge twice as much as I do. So when I say my estimate is 70 hours times your hourly rate, Andrew, you know what your hourly rate is?
Yes.
And sometimes it's lower and sometimes it's higher?
Correct.
Jim, you've got the same issue?
Same thing, yeah, depending on the client and the project.
Yes. Kevin, you've got a flexible hourly rate, what the market will bear? Everyone's got to figure this out based on their hourly rate. So if my hourly rate was $100 an hour, this website would cost $7,000. Everyone can figure that out. You know, I've been pretty cautious in my estimate. I think I'll probably do it in under 70 hours, but it's better to, I'd much rather come under than go over. So the first week, what we'll do today, I'm allowing 9 hours. The second week, what we'll see next week, is where I'm going to be doing most of my Photoshop work. Jim, is that a question?
Yeah, a couple questions from the internet, Eric, thanks. Did you make the wireframes, this is from Joe Trees, did you make the wireframes and sitemaps before signing the contract?
No. So in a sense, I would sign the contract first, and then I would start building the wireframes. That would be part of my billable hours.
Thank you. And a request to show the wireframe again, please.
Absolutely. Let's just go back. So these were done really quickly. These were done in Illustrator, which is what I like to work in. There's lots of other wireframing tools. Some people like to use InDesign. Some people just like to draw them by hand, whatever tool you're most comfortable with. But the faster you can do them and the more clearly you can clarify the concept to the client, this is what I'm thinking about, and get some feedback. I sent these as PDFs. We talked on the phone a little bit. I didn't spend a lot of time on these. He was really very flexible and easy to work with. And this is what we settled on for a wireframe. He wanted contact as a separate area up in the header. He wanted save the date Memorial Weekend up in the header, navigation, and the other sections which you see here. Do you want me to hold on that for a moment?
We have a question from Castle on the internet. They want to know, how do you negotiate the contract without the wireframe and estimate first?
Oh, excuse me. Maybe I misunderstood the question earlier. I don't have the wire. I've sent them an estimate that said, this is the amount of time I think I'm going to be working on it. So I haven't started the wireframe until I've signed the contract, but I've written an estimate that said, this is what I think it's going to cost.
Okay, thank you.
Ready to proceed to the next step, or more questions? Moving ahead. So to clarify this, I wrote this estimate and said, once I begin wireframing and doing my research, et cetera, I think it's going to take this many hours to get through this phase one. Once I actually start designing something, working in Photoshop, asking for the client's feedback on those comps and refining them is going to take me 16 hours. Building it in HTML, adding the jQuery slideshow, fine-tuning my CSS, optimizing and slicing my graphics is going to be 10 hours in week 3. Phase 4, building out the subsequent pages. Now this site is going to be somewhere between 15 and 18 pages. This is where it gets really hard, and this is where I tell people when they're getting started, really define your separate tasks. Design is one phase, build is another. Everybody knows what their skill level is in Photoshop. Jim, you've been using Photoshop for 10 or 15 years?
About 15, the day it came out.
Yeah, and you know that you can design a comp in, you know what you can do in 2 hours, 4 hours, or 8 hours. But your coding skills are not quite as strong as your Photoshop skills. So make sure that your client understands that these are really finite. I actually, at this point, it takes me longer to design than to code. I can code much faster, but it didn't used to be that way. It used to be I'd knock something out in Photoshop, and then I would slave for hours to code it properly. As long as you understand that these are distinct phases and need to be billed separately, you can either go by your estimate and somewhere in your contract, and I'm not going to get into this because I'm not a lawyer, you should, somewhere you need to say, this is my estimate, additional hours beyond my estimate are billed at my hourly rate. All of us have eaten a few hours along the way because we didn't want to offend the client, and some of us have frequently, or sometimes we finish the project early, come in on time and under budget, and we pocket a little change. I think that all balances out in the long run. Everyone has to make their own decisions how to handle those situations. But the real hard part here, this is why it's my biggest chunk, is building out the subsequent pages, because I don't really know what those are going to look like. I'm allowing 24 hours. It might take a lot longer, but that's going to be the biggest chunk. And phase 5 is really pretty easy. I've really made this kind of overly generous. I think I can do that a lot faster than 10 hours. But once again, final edits, the big drawback about a website is they're never really done. There's always a few more edits, there's a few more changes, a few more tweaks. Can we put a new photo in there? Clients are human. Humans make changes. Kevin, is that a question?
You're probably going to get to this, but I see you have client responsibilities there.
Yes, and I'm going to highlight those in red along the way.
Oh, okay.
So I want to keep in mind for everyone here, I'm to be honest, I'm fudging these things a little bit. In terms of what I'm doing with the client and what I'm packaging for these class, it is not an identical representation. Some things will smoosh from week 1 to week 2 and so on. I'm giving you as a close an approximation to our process as possible. Some things have to be edited for simplicity and clarity. So running parallel to that, around the time, and this is what I would this is the process I would recommend that you work with your clients, running along that, as I'm doing this week 1, I want them to make sure that they give me their logo or any pertinent, maybe it's hex colors, maybe it's a style guide, maybe it's fonts that they want you to use, anything that you absolutely need to get started on design, make sure that the client gives that to you. And I did a bunch of research to similar music sites. I'm not going to show you all these now, but I looked at 30 different music sites and I sent the client screenshots and he said, I like these 3. So for my visual design inspiration, which we'll see next week, we'll look at the sites that the client liked and didn't like. By the time I get into week 2, and this is incredibly important, and it's probably the biggest miscommunication between clients and designers, is I need all the copy for the site. And I hear this from designers all the time. We say, can you get me the copy? And the clients will say, oh, sure, we have that in a Word doc. It's just in a file. We'll send it to you. And then weeks later, you're still waiting for the copy.
This is a big problem, I think, because there's also the issue of the copy needing to be SEO friendly. There's a lot of keywords that need to appear in that copy, and the client usually, they just have something they wrote for a brochure, or they don't think of copy in the way that the website needs to be.
You're absolutely right, and writing for the web is an art form, but it's not my specialty and not something I'm going to cover here.
Yeah.
So
I understand it may not be covered here, but it's a big deal.
I'm just going to worry about timelines and schedules.
Okay.
And that I want the client to have all the copy to me by a certain point if I'm going to start building. I don't really need it in phase 2, but I'm certainly going to need it by phase 3. But at this point, I'm asking for the things that are a week out. I want the copy for the additional pages, something which we don't have, but which we're going to have to drill down. Usually the images, particularly for a site like this, we're talking about bands and musicians. You know what it's like trying to get a photo out of a band? It's going to take longer than you think. You know what it's like getting a logo from a sponsor? It's going to take longer than you think. So I don't really have, this is an informal project plan. I don't have any of these dates set in stone. This is approximate. Everyone's workflow will be different, but I would recommend you get these. You need to have, here's a list of what I'm going to do, and then a list of responsibilities for the client. This is what I expect from you, and when. And at the very end, I'm going to need some help with proofreading and link checking, because there might be unique spellings on there which are unique to your product or service, which I'm not familiar with, or descriptions. There's certainly errors that I'm going to make describing your product or service, which only you can catch. So I'm going to need some collaboration, and then making sure that links to external sites work as well. Because despite our best intentions, we just copy and paste those URLs, and you need an extra set of eyes. So it has to be a collaboration. So nowadays, when I make a site, this is how I set up my workflow. I set up a bunch of folders in my root folder in Dreamweaver. For those of you not familiar with the concept, setting up a root folder means you've got a website already set to go. Your client has registered a domain, they have a hosting agreement, you have the username and password, and you've built a folder and you've used Dreamweaver to connect to the internet. I'm assuming that everyone there in our internet land is familiar with these concepts, because I'm not going over that today. But what I do want you to do is set up your folders that are appropriate for your project. And in our particular project, you can see that I have an images folder called IMG, which is going to hold all my images. I'm going to use a couple of different JavaScript files, and they're all in a folder called JS. I'm using 2 different style sheets. Those are all in a CSS folder. And I'm also going to use some separate fonts, which I've put in a font folder, which we're going to show you a link to later. Is this the only way to set up your files? Absolutely not. All you have to do is set up your files and folders in a way that makes sense to you. This is a way that works well for me and is intended to streamline my workflow, because the only way you make money in this is if you can do it quickly and efficiently. If I take longer than my 70 hours and it's my fault, I can't tell the client, hi, I'm bumbling, can I have more money? But if I do this more quickly and more efficiently, or better yet, if I come in on time and under budget, it'll only result in word of mouth, more referrals, and general positive warmth and empathy for everyone. You set up your files, that's the best way for your project. So one of the things that I'm going to do here is I'm going to start with a reset.css. Now, people who have taken my previous Dreamweaver classes, you've seen me methodically, step by step, strip the H1 tags, strip the unordered lists. For those of you who need a refresher on the concept, all browsers interpret an HTML document differently. They add a default margin and padding to each HTML element of approximately 10 to 14 pixels, and Dreamweaver recreates that. So in my previous Dreamweaver classes, I've made an H1 tag and I've set its margin and padding to 0. I've made an unordered list and I've set its margin and padding to 0 and set its list style type to none. This is a really valuable experience in the beginning or when you're just starting out, because if you do it over and over again, you finally learn it. And I've created exercises where people get to do it over and over again to reinforce that skill set. I'm assuming that people in our internet audience have done this before, so I'm not going over that step. In a sense, by using a reset.css, the key here, if you look at my dotted red outline, is all my HTML elements have been set to a margin padding of 0. This is going to help me develop a little more quickly. And for those of you who are not familiar with the concept, I'll do it both ways once as we're going along to show you the tedious step that I'm eliminating. The reset that I'm using here, you can make your own reset if you like. The reset that I'm using here is Eric Meyer's reset. We put a link out there in the chat room to meyerweb.com. He's considered one of the greatest thinkers on CSS out there. His reset works really well. He gives it away for free, and you can just copy and paste it and save it as reset.css in your folder, in your particular root folder of your website. If you want to modify it, you can. It works really well for me. I'm also going to build it in HTML5. Now, HTML5 is not this big scary thing that you've heard about. It's not a flash killer. It's not going to change the nature of the internet. 90% of HTML5 is just HTML. It's really not that difficult. When you hear that HTML5 is a big game changer, we're really talking about the convergence of HTML5, CSS3, and jQuery, as well as a lot of web developer tools like drag and drop and geolocation and technologies which we're not even going to touch on. For those of you who I'm thinking are mostly designers and visual thinkers, if you're just learning how to make web pages, it's not difficult to jump to HTML5 at all. There's a couple, and I'm barely going to scrape the surface. I'm going to use the new semantic elements in HTML5. So the W3C, and actually it's the web working group, I guess, came up with the new HTML5 spec. Google did a big survey of 1 million or 1 billion web pages, and they tried to figure out what were some of the most common elements that were used in web pages over and over again. And they found out that they were header and nav and footer, things that you would expect. So instead of writing div ID header, we have some new, more semantically correct markup elements. We can just say header. Instead of saying div ID nav, we can just say nav. That, of course, means the nav needs to contain your navigation. The header needs to contain your header information, which will probably be an H1 tag. While you can certainly still use divs and you can use unique IDs, there's nothing wrong with them, you're probably more likely to use something called a section, which is a main body of a page, or an article, which is a chunk of a page, and then, of course, the new footer. I've got a link here at the bottom of my PDF. Special thanks to Remy Sharp and Bruce Lawson. They've got a great article on HTML5 and using these new techniques. So the problem with HTML5, and in case you haven't been following along, HTML5 has a new logo now, which you can see on the top of my screen. If you're building your site in HTML5, the W3C encourages you to put the HTML5 logo on it so that we can all get a uniform acceptance of it. The drawback, of course, and people come to me and they say, HTML5, can you make that work in IE6? And I say, of course you can, but you need to know a couple of tricks. The first thing, and we'll see this when I get into Dreamweaver, you need to declare the new HTML5 doc type, which is the easiest doc type to remember. You don't need to copy and paste it or let Dreamweaver write it for you anymore. It's just doc type HTML. But you need to link to a JavaScript file called create.js, which you see here in the center of my page, which just says, hey, Internet Explorer, I want you to recognize these new articles. And Internet Explorer says, okay, now that I see your JavaScript, I'll do that. And then you need to talk to your style sheet and tell all these new elements, which Internet Explorer is now recognizing, to display them as block level elements. So I know that's a bit of a technical mouthful. Any response from the chat room before I go on to the next step?
Some people asking for that link. We have some people asking about the link, the HTML5 link that you just posted.
There we go. I think I have that open in my browser right here. The HTML5 link for the...
It was on the previous slide.
Yes. Let's go back one. You mean this link? That should just launch my browser, right? HTML5doctor.com, designing a blog with HTML5. If you just get to htmldoctor.com, you can find it from there. Do you want me to hold that there for a moment so you guys can type it? Success?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Oops. Back to Keynote. So just to repeat, since I know this is kind of hard, we're not doing a ton of it in HTML5. We're declaring the new doc type. We're referencing a JavaScript file so that IE can understand the new semantic elements. We're writing a little bit of CSS so that IE can render the new semantic elements. Matt Swecki?
Is the link to the JavaScript in the head of the document, is that only for Internet Explorer 6, or is that?
I think this is actually for 6, 7, and 8.
Okay.
And I'm just linking to this is all it is, this 5 lines. I've just put it in a separate file in my JS folder.
Okay.
I can't remember where IE starts to understand it, but it's somewhere along the chain. So the way I like to work now is once I've built my wireframe, before I even go into Photoshop, I make a bunch of colored boxes and divs in Dreamweaver to make sure my layout works, to make sure my HTML5 is working, to make sure my embedded fonts are working, to make sure my jQuery slideshow is working before I even begin designing anything, because as Andrew knows really well, when you try to get your jQuery slideshow working towards the end of your website process, it can get kind of frustrating.
Correct, yes. I've actually gone through about 5 or 6 different jQuery slideshows.
Yes, and once you try to make a jQuery slideshow work in your finished design and something breaks and you've got no recourse, you get really frustrated.
Just give up and start over.
Yes, give up and start over. So if I know this is going to work early on, if I know this is working in Dreamweaver before I begin designing, I'm going to design within the limitations that I've created for myself, but I'm going to make a more successful design and have a more streamlined process. I'm also going to link to the Google Font API because I think this is something everyone should be using. There's no reason not to be using embedded fonts in your pages right now. The typographic purists among us might get a little frustrated because if I leave here briefly and go to Safari, I'll open a new tab. Come on. There we go. The Google font directory. So this is amazing. Google is storing all these fonts on their servers, and there's probably 40 of them now. When we first started looking at this last May, there was 8 of them. They're not all fonts that Jim and I would use, but everybody...
No lobster.
No lobster. I would not use calligraffiti, but every website and every designer has their own needs. There's something here for everyone. This is a great way to start using embeddable fonts in your pages, and it's free, and I have a really good feeling that Google's going to be around for a while. They're not going to fold. As you can see, there's a lot more than there were just a few months ago. I know that I like using slab serifs right now. This isn't quite the font that I want, but it's pretty close, and if I had to settle for it, I'm going to go with Arvo. And I'm going to click on Use This Font. And I'm going to copy one line of code. And that's going to work in my website. So I don't actually have Arvo installed on this computer, but it's close enough for my purposes right now. Even if I make a Photoshop comp in a similar slab serif, if there's a slight difference by the time the site launches, I can probably live with that. But also, if I know this is working, if I know the linkage is working and it works across browsers, and CSS3 font embedding will work on Internet Explorer 6, 7, and 8 right out of the box without any special hacks. The only one it's not going to work in is Firefox 3 for Windows and a couple of older browsers. As long as you have something what we call a font stack, as long as you have a backup, for example, if I have a Georgia, Times, and a default sans serif, which will still work and not break my design if the Arvo doesn't load on the rare occasional browser, I should be fine. Once I've declared that, once I've made that link to the Google Font API, I just need to write a little CSS like this. Excuse me, in my printout here it says Arial and serif instead of Georgia and sans serif. I'm not trying to be confusing. And so if you recognize my CSS here, it says all H2 tags are going to use the font family Arvo. As soon as this launches in the browser, it's going to go to Google server, find the CSS, find the font outlines, and render it in my page in about, sometimes it takes 2 or 3 seconds. You might see a little flicker, but it works pretty reliably. We're going to pause for a moment as we hand the microphone to Kevin.
Thanks. So it's the quote, the single quotes around Arvo that
Yes.
tell everybody that this is a Google font or whatever.
Actually, this tells the browser that we're using CSS3 at font face syntax. But yes,
Okay.
the single quotes are important, and I'm glad you mentioned that.
Okay, thanks.
And also, as a backup, I'm going to use at font face with some fonts stored on in my actual font folder. So if you want to go a little more robust than what Google offers, if you want to have more control over your fonts, you need 4 font formats. You need, and bear with me now because this is a mouthful, an EOT, a WOFF, a TTF, and an SVG. In case that doesn't make any sense, that's the EOT is only for Windows. It's the Explorer Open type. The WOFF is the Web Open Font format. The TTF is True Type. Anyone with a print background recognizes these. And the SVG is Scalable Vector Graphics, which we need for the iPad and the iPhone. You need to reference all of these, and then you need to write a little CSS that says I'm going to be using them. I'm going to be using a font called League Gothic, which you can find right here as a free download from the League of Movable Type. This is one of my favorite fonts, and I know that one of the reasons I want to embed this font because I couldn't find a similar condensed font on the Google Font API that I liked, and I knew that in my navigation bar we had a lot of navigation items that had long names, and I knew I needed a condensed font to be able to fit them all in, and I'm quite fond of League Gothic. Great classic condensed font, I think built on the original outlines from Morris Fuller Benton. You guys are learning about him right now, aren't you? Type class? Oh well, soon enough. It's a great font. Download that if you want. And I'm not going to go over all the rest of the syntax right now, but as we get to it, I'll show you more about how that works.
Quick question.
Kevin.
This code right here, is this in the header? Where is all this code?
This is in my
gonna
style
show up?
sheet.
That's in your style sheet.
In my style sheet, yes.
Okay. And there's no JS code in that particular
No, my
screen
JS
right
code's
now.
in my JS folder.
Okay, yeah.
And my CSS is in my CSS folder.
Good.
Keep it tidy. So I'm not going to go over all this JavaScript code either. This is mostly for my PDF notes for people who are purchasing the class. I'm adding a jQuery slideshow. I'm adding it now because I want it to work. I don't want to find out later that it doesn't work. I want to test drive it and make sure everything's functioning before I get too deep into it. What this is basically saying is this links to the jQuery, my local file. This links to the jQuery API, which is on a remote server. And this is my HTML, which is holding my images. I'll go more into depth on this later. I'm also going to install some Google Analytics code. There's many analytics programs out there, but this is going to give me really valuable data. As you can see, the number of people, so this is the Google Analytics code from my site. The number of people using Internet Explorer is 4.11% out of 1,000 or so people who went to my site last month. And within that, I think out of that 4%, as I dug down a little deeper, the ones using IE6, it was like 12 people. So I know that my personal site, I don't need to make it work in IE6. But if the jffa.org had Google Analytics installed, I'm sure they would come up with a higher number for IE6, but we would have some accurate data to work with. So going forward, whoever has their site in the future is going to get some real meaningful data. And Google Analytics makes this really easy. I assume you all have a Gmail account now. Anybody who doesn't have a Gmail account should just get one. Because if you have a Gmail account, you can get analytics for free. I just access it. I copy this code into the first page of my site, and I can start getting reports within 48 hours. And then every week, because this is sort of a real live project plan sort of process, I'm going to deliver an invoice at the end of every week. So my goal was to do this in 9 hours. I actually ended up spending 7 hours in the first week, which is what I'm going to take you through for the rest of today. It's pretty straightforward. I'm sure the hard work and the hair pulling out will happen by weeks 2 and 3.
Eric, can I interrupt for a second? Go
Absolutely.
Back just a sec. Paula Rama is asking, she brought up with some graphic designers to show them there are options, and was told some of their developers told them not to trust @font face. And she had a previous question asking, why is there still a resistance to @font face? But
I would respectfully disagree. I say start using @font face today. I'm having no problem. I've been testing it across multiple browsers. You're going to have a 98% success rate.
Eric, another question from the chat room. Is it okay to make the slideshow in Flash instead of jQuery?
If you like using Flash, go right ahead, but I'm discouraging people from pursuing Flash right now. If Flash meets the needs of your particular project, but I don't think it meets the needs of this particular project, I think anyone who's learning web design now should be really thinking about not getting too deep, not being too dependent on Flash as a skill set, because it's not going to, and I know this is a big about face. Those of you who've been with us with creativeLIVE since the beginning, I came on as the Flash guy. Craig hired me to teach Flash classes, and I was so excited about Flash. The landscape changes so quickly. If you're just beginning, I don't recommend you sink a lot of energy into Flash. HTML5, CSS3, jQuery, that's where the jobs are.
You have some iPads or iPhone users out there, and your
Yes.
Flash won't work for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Flash doesn't work on Apple's mobile devices, but I'm just seeing less and less call for work, at least in the Seattle area, and the people that I talk to, there's less demand for Flash. Flash might be fun for you to build your project in, but it's not a valuable skill to develop right now.
And Eric, another question. What if the users have the JavaScript disabled? Does the whole site just fall apart? If a lot of
Yes.
your information is relying on that slideshow.
Yes, they won't be able to see the slideshow. Users who have JavaScript disabled are usually more advanced users than less sophisticated users because they've made that choice to make that preference in their browser. They could turn it back on if they wanted to see the slideshow. You can't make every website perfect for everyone. So if I made a Flash slideshow, it wouldn't appear to a small select group of users. If I made a jQuery slideshow, it still won't appear to a small select group of users. Everyone that I'm talking to says use jQuery, use JavaScript if you want to be a forward-thinking web designer. And the number of people who don't have JavaScript working in modern browsers is very tiny. So unlikely.
Okay.
So with that said, let's go into Dreamweaver and let's build this. Phase 1, let's do everything that I'm going to build before I actually start designing. I'm going to make a new document, and here in my document type, I'm going to make this HTML5. And I actually should have done what I should have done a little sooner is I should have gone to my preferences and made that the default. So I'm telling you, if I could find where it is. Well, I'll do that later. Document type, new document maybe. The default document type HTML5. So going forward, I'm just going to build all my sites in HTML5. I could change this. The one caveat I have for that is, what if you're tying it to someone's existing website, you're building out new pages, pages 90 to 100 on a site that was previously only 90 pages. If you're tying into an existing framework, you clearly can't change the entire site over if you're only building a portion of it. But as I build new projects going forward, I'm going to do them all in HTML5. I'm going to go into code view, and you can see that it says doc type HTML, and I should probably increase my type size a little bit. Let's go to Dreamweaver, Preferences, Fonts. Do you think that's a good size for the internet?
I think that's looking good to me from here, and I'm
Okay.
practically blind. Hey, Erica, from the chat room, they'd like to know what version of Dreamweaver you're using, and can they take this class with Dreamweaver 8?
Absolutely. I'm using Dreamweaver CS5, but the great thing about Dreamweaver, it's not version dependent. It just writes really good HTML and CSS. So you should open this up. You could open this up in Notepad. You can open this up in TextEdit. Dreamweaver 8, Dreamweaver CS3, Dreamweaver CS4, everything that we're doing today, you should be able to do in those. Some of the windows and panels might look a little different, but we're focusing on the code.
And the size is looking good, so you're good to go.
Fantastic. Thank you. So here I've got my original document, my new document. Let's save that into my root folder called JFFA and save it as index.html, because we always want to save the first page on a website as index.html. And let's just make sure that now that we're using HTML5, that Internet Explorer can understand what we're trying to do. I'm just going to copy a line of code right here. Here we go. In the head of the document, create.js. I'm linking to create.js, and I should really title my document, shouldn't I? Because there's nothing more embarrassing than untitled document. So that helps Internet Explorer understand these new semantic elements that we're going to use. I'm going to go into Design View for a minute, and remember I said there's these new semantic elements because that were based on these most common trends, nav, header, footer. Ironically, there's one that they didn't include, which would be called container. You would think that they would say container or wrapper, that would be one dominant div they would come up with a new semantic element for, but they didn't. So I still have to begin with one div, and if you remember how this works in Dreamweaver, insert layout object div tag. I'm just going to call this one container. I'm going to make a new CSS rule. And for right now, I'm going to do it in this document only just to get us started. And I'll make this 960 pixels across and 700 pixels wide. And I'm just going to give it our dotted red border so we can see it a little better, because it's just an invisible box until it has a border. I'm going to click OK. And there's my original div and my container. But as you can see in the top left corner, it's not flush. This is the default margin and padding that we're talking about, that all browsers and Dreamweaver, to approximate those browsers, is adding to our pages. This is why we want to add our reset, because every time I add an H1 tag, every time I add an unordered list, it's going to give me this extra space. So I'm going to go to my CSS styles window, and I'm going to attach a style sheet, which I happen to have in this folder, in my CSS folder, called reset.css. This is the Eric Meyer reset that we looked at earlier. I'm going to hit choose and OK. And you see how my container got flush in the top left corner? That default margin padding is now gone. I would have had to do this every single time I added an element, strip it out to 0 manually, but since my reset is attached, actually let me take that away for a minute. Let me strip one down manually and then reattach it. So this is what it looks like. What I would have to do is say new CSS rule. I would need to talk to the body tag, and I would need to set its margin and padding to 0 to get the same effect. That's really fun the first time, but the 4th, 8th, and 12th time it becomes really tedious. So I will just get rid of that style, and re-put in my link to my reset CSS so I don't have to do that over and over again.
Eric, I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Once you've done that and you're linking to that in your CSS, as you create new divs and you go to edit them, will it already have that style, that zero margin?
Divs don't get zeroed out. Semantic elements, H1 through H2, H3, H6 tags, unordered lists, those sort of things have additional padding, but divs don't. So you never have to say div margin and padding equals 0.
Thank you.
HTML5 question. In your code where it's calling the JS file, it says text equals JavaScript, and that's not necessary, correct, in HTML5?
That's true, actually, it isn't. That's true.
Did you leave it in just
I just was
copy and paste?
copying and pasting,
Okay.
yes. He is actually correct that you don't need to reference the text equals type JavaScript. Dreamweaver just sort of puts that in, and I didn't take it out.
Okay, that was from Sue.
She's correct. So now I've got a container, and I'm going to start putting in some building blocks for divs. I'm going to highlight this code and go back into code view. If I know I'm in the container, I'm going to say, now normally we would say insert layout object div tag, but I'm just going to go into code view and I'm going to just start typing. And you notice I typed in an opening bracket and HE, and Dreamweaver starts to autofill for me, and it recognizes these new HTML5 elements. And now I just need to say, put in a closing tag. So there's my initial header. It doesn't look like much yet because I haven't given it any style, but in my style sheet, and this would be a good time actually to make a new style sheet. Let's go File, New, CSS. Save that as newstyle.css in JFFA. When I say make a new style and define it in, come on, why won't you link? Get that in a sec. Dreamweaver will recognize these new semantic elements. This is a continuous selection of container header. I'm just going to simplify that or make it less specific and just say style the header this way. It's not here, hold on. Try this again. Header in this document only, yes. And let's just make that 200 pixels high. And we'll just give it a light blue background color for now. Saving that. Why is my header not working? Bear with me for a moment. Maybe my style sheet's not linked, that's why.
Yep, style sheet's not linked yet.
What I needed to do is link the new style sheet as well. Let's try that again. Let's just get my code up here. Header, header. Well, clearly I have a broken linkage somewhere. Let me just try to define it one more time in the document.
Sue noticed that you saved the new style sheet in the root folder and maybe not in your...
Not in my CSS folder, but I
Correct.
did link to it. She is correct. Well, let's just go grab some code from the other one for a minute. Oh, because I know why, because I haven't defined my new block level elements. Let's do that in our style sheet as well. what I need to do is tell them to display as block. Render HTML5 elements as a block. Copy that into new style. There we go. So the JS tells that the new HTML5 elements exist to Internet Explorer. The CSS tells them to display as a block level element so they can be rendered in this rendering engine. So there's our new semantic markup, our first element. And that's happening in newstyle.css. And this is what the code looks like. Header, footer, section, aside, nav, and article all need to be told to display as a block level element.
Eric, question from a couple people on the internet. In your CSS file that you were just in?
My newstyles.css?
Yeah, they were asking, they thought that pound header would be header with the tag around it as a tag.
So I guess in HTML5, how you just have that just header now, is it necessary in CSS to call pound header, or should it just be header in your CSS?
Let's see what happens when we take it away. If I save that, that still works. So both work. So now let's put in our navigation. Going into our code, at the end of the header, actually in our header, let's put in our h1 tag because it's our header. And we'll just write JFFA for now and close h1. And we've got a basic h1 tag. This is a lot smaller than it would normally be because I've taken its size down in my reset. At the end of my header, I want to put in my new nav element. Now, you might have more than one navigation in your page. You might have a side nav and a footer nav. So if I styled them, if I made a CSS rule for the nav, they would all look alike. So this is a good idea now is a good time to give this nav a unique ID. So I'll go back one side and one step and say ID equals main, because this is our main navigation. Close nav. Now I don't actually remember all the steps in our navigation, so I'm going to copy my unordered list. So if you remember from your rules of CSS for layout, you want to use unordered lists for navigation because they're semantically correct. So I'm going to go from opening UL to closing UL tag and grab all these list items, copy them, and paste them in my nav ID main. Now right now they're hanging out down below and I need to straighten those up. And I want to talk to my list items. So I'm going to make a new CSS rule. All the list items or LI tags in main or main LI in newstyle.css, I want to tell them to display as block level elements. And I think I want them to be about 130 pixels wide, 50 pixels high, and float left. Maybe we can go a little wider than that. Any questions from the internet so far?
Not pertinent to this
Okay.
spot right now.
Continuing. After that nav, I want to put another container to hold the bottom of the page. Matt Swecky's had a question.
A question about just general workflow. Do you find it, as a practice, easier to create, like you create a new style to begin with at the start of the project, and then when you create a rule, you designate it as part of the new style CSS?
Did you make a new style sheet at the start of the project?
Yeah.
Yes.
Or just create the styles as you go, and then at the end.
And then export them?
Yeah.
Either one is fine. What he's talking about is, should I put the styles in the head of the document, or should I put them in an external style sheet? Either one works What actually, if I'm building just one page, I put them in the head of the document.
Yeah.
But if I know I'm going to build a multi-page site, I go and put I'll put them in an external style sheet. Okay. But there's nothing wrong with starting in the head and then moving them later.
Eric, I have one more question for you from the chat room. Why are you using only fixed widths right now? Are you concerned with a fluid layout of your site?
I'm not concerned with fluid layout. I do want a fixed width for the final design because I know that's one thing that the client wants.
Okay, thanks.
You know, because I have a lot of ground to cover, I'm going to speed this up just a little bit to get my main sections in the bottom. Instead of building these div by div, I'm going to copy a little bit of code. And I'm just going to grab my entire middle section, which includes a div called slideshow. And this unique ID for slideshow is important, as well as these image sources. Now, this is going to look a little awkward at first because it's going to look like I've got a bunch of JPEGs just crowding my page. But I'm going to fix that shortly. I'm going to go all the way down to my footer and just before my closing body tag. I'm going to copy this code. I'm going to put it in here because we have more important things to do than build these div by div. The problem with a jQuery slideshow is all these images are currently in my HTML document flow. And I don't exactly have enough, and not all my CSS has been styled yet. I'm going to need to put these things into place by taking this div called top left, making a new CSS rule for it, giving it a width of 250 pixels, and telling to float left, which sort of moves that stuff over pretty well. And then taking my div called slideshow, and making a new style for that, and giving it a width of 700 and telling it to float left as well. For those of you who need a refresher on floats, one float which precedes everything else in the HTML document flow is going to pull all the other divs or containers up and over to position them into place. And I've got one other div called artists here. No, I guess that's still H2. List of artists is, and it's, well, we'll catch that div later. So now I'm going to reference my Google Font API to get some of these, some of my headlines styled. By going to, oh, that's my Google Analytics code. Going to my browser, going to my Arvo font family, copying this link, returning to Dreamweaver, putting that in the head of my document, and that's all I really need to be linked to the API, and then styling my H2 tags to reference that Arvo font. And including a font stack backup, so Arial and Serif, and giving it a size, in this case, of 24 pixels. Saving that, returning to my index. Now, you're not going to see this right away in Dreamweaver, but when we switch into live view, you can see that indeed I'm getting this slab serif. Now, I could fine-tune this later, but what I really want to find out at this point is, are these working? Can I use this font? Will I be able to use it later? Now I'm going to make my jQuery slideshow work. This line of code references the external JavaScript library, the jQuery library, which is stored on google.com. There's lots of jQuery libraries which you can reference at jQuery.com as well. What this is the result, the benefit of a lot of open source web developers building a code library that has a JavaScript engine which works in the background. All you need to do is link to it This line right here is a subsequent free file which I've downloaded, which is going to control the functionality of what's happening on my page. And this piece of JavaScript right here is controlling my actual slideshow. As a rule, you don't touch this at all. You touch this only if you really know JavaScript, and people like you and myself, we touch this part. I can certainly control how this works. I could change the type of effect right here, fade to hover or shuffle. There's a lot of different effects. I could change the speed. I can change the timeout. I can modify this a little bit, but you don't need to know a lot of jQuery in order to be able to work with this. So I'm going to grab this whole chunk of code right here, which references my jQuery, and put that in the head of my document. I like to keep my JavaScript together and my CSS together. And what Matt was talking about earlier, he says, do you build these things in the head of the document and then export them? I certainly can. I don't need that one anymore. There's two ways you can do this. You can simply cut and paste to move it into the new style sheet, or you can say, you can find that container style right here and say move CSS rules from this top right corner contextual menu. Move to new style.css, click OK, and now I don't need this clutter in my document. Everything's in my style sheet, as you were talking about earlier. So my font is working, my new semantic elements are working, my jQuery slideshow is working. I'm going to be building this again next week from scratch. This is sort of going over it really quickly in case anybody feels like they were missing it. This is not the sum total of instruction on these things. This is so I know this is all working before I even begin building my Photoshop document. So now I can test this in the browser. And I know that I've already tested this in, on Adobe Browser Lab, and I've seen it working. And I've tested it on IE6, IE7, IE8. I know the fonts work. I know the jQuery slideshow works. I know the HTML5 elements work. I'm going to use this as a template for my Photoshop design as I start next week. But since I know these things are working, I know it's going to streamline my workflow.
A quick question from Craig. He just wanted to clarify, where were you getting all the div nav and all the code, the CSS? Was that previously written?
The div nav,
The stuff that you were,
the HTML code or the CSS code?
I guess both. Did you already have that previously written?
Some of these things that I copied and pasted in my previous file just because we're a little pressed for time.
Okay.
My jQuery code I'm getting from the jQuery cycle plugin. Which I strongly recommend. So this is free and open source. jQuery.malsup.com, malsup, M-A-L-S-U-P.com, cycle. I downloaded this for free and implemented it pretty quickly. So I'm going to zoom in on that for a moment so you guys can see that URL. As I mentioned before, I got my reset CSS from Eric Meyer. I linked to my font at Google. And the one other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add my Google Analytics tracking code. And I do this at the beginning of the project so it's there and ready to go. And perhaps even as I'm doing the build, I can start getting some analytics data about who's looking at the site. And you paste this near they have instructions, you paste this near the bottom of your document, just before the closing body tag. You would need an account with Google Analytics, but if you have a Gmail account, you can just sign in. If you want to use a different analytics product, you certainly could. And now I can start getting some real-time information on this page.
Eric, one trick I've been doing with clients is if they're not using Google Analytics, I paste it into their current site before I even start working.
Yes.
So I get some information.
That's a great idea.
Before
if you can access that.
Even a month ahead or
Right.
2 months ahead of time.
And all you need is the FTP access to do that, to put it in one page and start gathering some data. They don't even need to know it's there. As long as you have a Gmail account, you can access that analytics data, because you've got the tracking code. That's a great idea.
And Sue just pointed out that Google recently changed that they want the code in the top of the page now, I guess as of 1 or 2 months ago.
Okay, I was using the old code, but
Okay.
they have instructions on their website. But tell Sue I said thanks. So I'm going to go back to my previous version that I built just before this, which is a little bit more robust. I've got Arvo here for my H2 tags. I've got my divs working. I've got my HTML5 elements. I've got my jQuery slideshow working. I know I've got a footer working in here. Since I know that these basic proportions roughly match my wireframe, I'm going to use this as my first layer in my Photoshop document next week and build up on top of this. So if I can match this div layout with these floats and so forth, I know that I'm going to run into less problems next week.